In the scorching heat of the summer of 1683, the future of all European civilization hung in the balance. Not across vast battlefields, not on multiple fronts, but concentrated in a single point on the map. One city, Vienna, the final barrier between two worlds. Coming from the eastern horizon advanced the greatest military force the world had witnessed in decades. The Ottoman Empire, master of 3 continents, lord of vast territories stretching from the sands of North Africa to the mountains of the Caucasus, had gathered its total strength. 300,000 warriors marched in formation. It was a terrifying spectacle. Endless rows of janissaries in their impeccable uniforms and white turbans that gleamed beneath the sun. Sipahi cavalry with gleaming armor and lances raised toward the sky. Tatar horsemen from the eastern steppes, known for their ferocity and cruelty, galloped on the flanks, howling their ancestral war cries. Green banners of Islam rippled for miles, creating a sea of fabric that seemed to undulate like the very waves of the ocean. The sound was deafening. Enormous drums beat in constant rhythm, echoing through the valleys like thunder that never ceased. Hundreds of cannons were dragged by teams of oxen and horses, their wheels creaking under the brutal weight of cast bronze. It was more than an army. It was an entire nation in motion, carrying with it blacksmiths, bakers, engineers, doctors, imams, and thousands of camp followers. Supply wagons stretched as far as the eye could see. This was not a raid. This was conquest. Total, absolute, final conquest. And facing this unstoppable tide stood Vienna, a city of barely 15,000 defenders. Old men who had never held a sword, young boys who had never seen war, priests who traded their prayer books for muskets, citizens who filled sandbags with trembling hands, soldiers who knew the mathematics of their situation, who could count, who understood that the odds were 20 to 1 against them. Crumbling medieval walls that had been built in a different era for a different kind of warfare. Towers that leaned at dangerous angles. Gates reinforced with whatever timber and iron could be found. Bastions packed with earth and stones, hastily repaired from previous conflicts. For 60 days and 60 nights, this city would burn. For 60 days, its people would fight not for glory, not for conquest, not even for victory, but simply for one more sunrise, one more breath, one more moment of existence. It was a confrontation between civilizations, Islam and Christendom, the might of empire versus the desperation of resistance, the darkness of annihilation against the flickering hope of dawn. And when the smoke finally cleared, when the blood had soaked into the earth, when the last cannon had fired its final shot, one truth would resound across the centuries, echoing through every generation that came after. That courage, not numbers, determines the fate of nations. That will, not weapons, decides the destiny of peoples. That sometimes in the darkest hour, when all seems lost, when reason says surrender, when logic demands submission, there exists something deeper, something primal, something eternal within the human spirit that says no, not today, not ever. This is the story of the Second Siege of Vienna, the battle that saved Europe from the brink of conquest, the moment when history itself held its breath. For more than 2 centuries, the Ottoman Empire had nursed a singular obsession. Europe, that green, fractured, wealthy continent beyond the Danube. And Vienna was the key that would unlock it all, the gateway to the heart of Christendom, the door through which Ottoman armies could pour into Germany, France, Italy, and beyond. This was not the first time Ottoman eyes had turned toward Vienna's walls. The memory of the first siege was carved deep into the collective consciousness of both empires. It had happened over a century and a half earlier, in the year 1529. Back then, the Ottoman Empire was at the absolute zenith of its power, led by perhaps its greatest sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent. His name alone struck terror across Europe. He was the Shadow King, the Lord of Lords, the commander of the faithful, the Caesar of his age. In September of 1529, Suleiman had brought his magnificent army to Vienna's gates. Over 100,000 men had surrounded the city. For weeks, They had battered the walls with cannon fire and mining operations. The siege engines had roared day and night. Ottoman sappers had dug beneath the fortifications, packing tunnels with gunpowder, blowing massive craters in the defenses. Wave after wave of assault troops had thrown themselves at the breaches. The Janissaries, the elite warrior corps of the empire, had fought with fanatical courage, climbing over their own dead to reach the ramparts. But Vienna had held. Barely, desperately, but it had held. The defenders, led by Count Nicholas von Somme, had fought like men possessed. Every breach was sealed. Every assault was repelled. The weather had turned against the Ottomans. Autumn rains had transformed the landscape into a sea of mud. Supply lines stretched thin. Disease ravaged the camps. And then winter had come early that year, bitter and cruel. Snow fell in October. The roads became impassable. Suleiman, the great sultan, had been forced to make a decision no conqueror wants to make. He ordered the retreat. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers had died on that march back to Istanbul, frozen in the mountain passes, lost in the snowdrifts. The army had limped home, defeated not primarily by the enemy, but by distance, weather, and the limits of human endurance. Suleiman never forgot that humiliation. He never stopped dreaming of returning. But age and other wars intervened. He died in 1566, his dream of conquering Vienna still unfulfilled. Yet that dream never died with him. It passed down through generations of Ottoman rulers like a sacred inheritance. Vienna remained the wound that never healed, the victory that waited to be claimed, the proof that remained unproven. For the Ottomans, it was more than military strategy. It was destiny. It was pride. It was the unfinished business of empire. By the late 1600s, the political landscape of Europe was a fractured mosaic of competing powers, religious divisions, and ancient grudges. The Holy Roman Empire, that vast but loosely connected network of German states, was led by the Habsburg dynasty from Vienna. But the Habsburgs were surrounded by enemies and rivals on every side. To the west, France under King Louis XIV was at the height of its power. The Sun King had transformed France into the dominant military force in Western Europe. But Louis had no love for the Habsburgs. He saw them as rivals for dominance over the German states. In fact, Louis XIV policies actively worked to weaken Habsburg power. He formed alliances with German princes against the emperor. He even maintained diplomatic relations with the Ottoman Empire, sending ambassadors to Istanbul, much to the horror of other Christian kingdoms. For Louis, politics trumped religion. French power mattered more than Christian unity. Within the empire itself, religious tensions still simmered. The 30 Years' War had ended just 35 years earlier, in 1648, leaving Germany devastated and divided. Catholics and Protestants still viewed each other with deep suspicion. Old wounds had never truly healed. Cities that had been burned, populations that had been massacred, grievances that had been passed down through generations. To the north, the Protestant kingdoms of Scandinavia and the Dutch Republic watched the Catholic Habsburgs warily. To the south, the Italian states were caught in their own complex web of alliances and rivalries. Spain, once the most powerful nation on earth, was now in decline, its empire weakening, its treasury empty from endless wars. And to the east, Poland-Lithuania formed a massive but increasingly unstable commonwealth. The Polish nobility jealously guarded their privileges, making centralized government nearly impossible. The kingdom was powerful but chaotic, democratic to the point of dysfunction, with each noble having the right to veto any decision of parliament. This was the Europe that faced the Ottoman threat in 1683. Divided, suspicious, unable to coordinate, more interested in fighting each other than in facing the common danger approaching from the east. In Istanbul, Sultan Mehmed IV ruled the Ottoman Empire. But Mehmed was not particularly interested in the daily grind of governance or military campaigns. He preferred hunting, festivities, and the pleasures of the palace. Real power rested in the hands of his Grand Vizier, the Prime Minister of the Empire, a man named Kara Mustafa Pasha. Kara Mustafa, was everything his sultan was not: ambitious, driven, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. He had risen through the Ottoman system through a combination of political skill, military competence, and calculated marriages into powerful families. He was not born to greatness. He had seized it with both hands and refused to let go. Mustafa was a man haunted by history and driven by dreams of immortality. He knew the story of Suleiman's failed siege. He had studied every detail of that campaign, and he believed with absolute conviction that he could succeed where even the great Suleiman had failed. He believed that destiny itself had chosen him to accomplish what no previous Ottoman leader had achieved: to take Vienna, to open the gates of Europe, to expand the empire farther than it had ever reached before. He presented his plan to Sultan Mehmed with masterful persuasion. "Give me your blessing, and I will present you with Vienna as a gift," he promised. "I will open the road to all of Europe. The kingdoms of Germany will fall before us like wheat before the scythe. The treasures of the continent will flow into your treasury. Your name will be remembered as the greatest sultan who ever lived, the man who finally conquered the Christians." The sultan, flattered and excited by these grand visions, gave his approval. More than approval, he gave Mustafa nearly unlimited resources. The entire might of the Ottoman war machine was placed at his disposal. From every corner of the empire, troops were summoned. From Anatolia came regiments of Sipahi cavalry, elite horsemen who had trained since childhood in the arts of war. From the Balkans came Christian vassals, Serbian and Bulgarian troops who fought for the Sultan under threat of destruction to their homelands. From the Crimea came Tatar horsemen, savage raiders who struck terror wherever they rode. And at the core of the army marched the Janissaries. These are not ordinary soldiers. They were the elite, the pride of the empire, the shadow of God on earth, as they called themselves. Taken as boys from Christian families through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, trained in special schools, they became the most disciplined and feared infantry in the world. They wore distinctive uniforms, white turbans, and carried muskets of the finest quality. They were bound by oath to the Sultan alone, forbidden to marry, dedicated entirely to war. And they were absolutely loyal, fanatical in their devotion to Islam and the empire. Behind the combat troops came the support apparatus of the campaign: engineers skilled in siege warfare, men who knew how to dig mines beneath walls, how to position artillery for maximum effect, how to construct siege towers and protective trenches. Thousands of laborers to do the physical work of building fortifications. Hundreds of artillery pieces, from massive siege guns that could hurl stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds to smaller field pieces for mobile warfare. Supply trains that stretched for miles, carrying food, ammunition, tools, tents, and all the materials needed to sustain an army of unprecedented size. Contemporary accounts describe the Ottoman army on the march as a sight that defied belief. A column of men and animals and wagons that took more than a week to pass a single point. At night, their campfires covered the landscape like stars fallen to earth. The sound of their drums could be heard for miles, a constant rhythm that announced their approach long before they could be seen. In Vienna, Emperor Leopold, I received increasingly alarming reports throughout the spring of 1683. Ottoman armies were gathering. Fortresses along the frontier were falling one by one. Refugees streamed westward with stories of devastation. The Turks were coming, they said, and this time they would not stop. Leopold was a deeply religious man, a patron of the arts and music, cultured and educated. But he was not a warrior. He had never led troops in battle. He was a politician and administrator, more comfortable in the council chamber than on the battlefield. And he faced an impossible situation. His advisors were divided. Some urged him to gather forces and meet the Ottomans in open battle before they reached Vienna. Others counseled caution, pointing out that the Habsburg army was not prepared for such a confrontation. The imperial treasury was nearly empty from previous wars. Troops were scattered across multiple fronts. And worst of all, Leopold could not count on help from the other powers of Europe. France was actively hostile to Habsburg interests. Louis XIV had made it clear he would not lift a finger to help Vienna. In fact, French diplomats in various German courts actively worked to prevent states from sending aid to the emperor. The Protestant German princes were reluctant to commit their forces to save a Catholic emperor. The Italian states were too far away and too divided to offer meaningful assistance. Spain was willing but weak, unable to project military power beyond its own borders. Leopold sent desperate letters to every Christian monarch in Europe. He wrote to the Pope in Rome, begging for intervention. He appealed to the Polish king. He sent ambassadors to try to convince various German princes to honor their obligations to the empire. But responses were slow, non-committal, or outright refusals. As the Ottoman army drew closer, Leopold was forced to confront the terrible truth. Vienna could not be saved by the forces immediately available. If he stayed in the city, he risked being captured or killed, which would mean the end of the Habsburg dynasty and the collapse of the empire. The decision was made. On July 7, 1683, Emperor Leopold I fled Vienna. It was a humiliating moment. The emperor, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, abandoning his capital city to save his own life. He traveled west to Linz, then to Passau, always keeping distance between himself and the approaching Ottoman army. He took with him the court, the treasury, important documents, and as many nobles as could travel quickly. Left behind were the common people, the citizens who had no estates in the countryside to flee to, the soldiers who were duty-bound to defend the walls, and one man who would become the soul of the defense. Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg was not an obvious choice for greatness. He was in his early 30s, relatively young for such enormous responsibility. He came from a noble family, but not one of the most prominent. He had military experience, but had never commanded a defense of this magnitude. Yet Emperor Leopold chose him to lead Vienna's defense, and that choice would prove to be inspired. And then he addressed the garrison and the citizens. Standing on the walls as the Ottoman army approached, he spoke with simple, direct honesty. He did not sugarcoat their situation. He did not promise easy victory, but he reminded them what was at stake: their families, their faith, their very existence. If Vienna fell, everything they loved would be destroyed or enslaved. Their only choice was to stand and fight, and he would stand with them, first to face danger, last to seek safety. The soldiers and citizens heard his words and believed him, because they could see in his eyes that he meant every word. This was not a nobleman playing at war from a safe distance. This was a commander who would share every hardship, face every danger, and, if necessary, die alongside the men he led. On July 14, 1683, the horizon to the east turned black, not with storm clouds, but with the approaching Ottoman army. Scouts on Vienna's walls watched in growing dread as the vast host came into view. It seemed endless. Columns of soldiers that stretched from horizon to horizon. Cavalry units that numbered in the thousands. Artillery trains that required hundreds of animals to pull. Supply wagons that formed their own rivers of wood and canvas. The Ottoman army did not rush to attack. They came methodically, professionally, with the confidence of men who knew they had all the time in the world. Throughout the day, units took up positions around the city. By nightfall, Vienna was completely surrounded. Not a single road remained open. The Iron Ring had closed. That night, the people of Vienna witnessed a sight that would haunt their dreams. Thousands upon thousands of campfires blazed in the darkness beyond the walls, forming a glowing circle around the entire city. It was as if the stars themselves had fallen to earth and surrounded them. The sound drifted across the distance, drums beating rhythmically, voices singing unfamiliar melodies, the neighing of tens of thousands of horses, the shouts of men in foreign tongues, and above it all, the call to prayer echoing through the night, 5 times from sunset to sunrise, a constant reminder that an entirely different civilization now camped at their doorstep. In the center of this vast encampment stood the command tent of Kara Mustafa Pasha. It was not merely a tent, but a pavilion worthy of a sultan. Made of green silk embroidered with gold thread, it towered over the surrounding tents like a palace. Inside, Thick carpets covered the ground. Cushions and divans provided comfort. Servants moved silently, bringing refreshments and messages. And at the center sat Mustafa himself, calm and confident, already planning the siege that would make his name immortal. He summoned his commanders and laid out his strategy. This was to be a methodical siege, not a reckless assault. Ottoman engineers had perfected siege warfare over centuries. They would dig trenches to approach the walls safely, protecting their troops from defensive fire. They would construct mines beneath the fortifications, packing them with gunpowder to blow massive breaches. They would pound the walls with artillery until the stones crumbled. And only when Vienna was sufficiently weakened would they launch the final assault that would overrun the exhausted defenders. Mustafa was adamant about one point. He wanted Vienna captured intact. This city was to be his prize, his gift to the Sultan. He did not want ruins. He wanted the palaces, the churches, the treasures undamaged. This meant limiting the use of incendiary weapons and massive bombardment. It would make the siege longer, but the result would be more glorious. His officers agreed to the plan and dispersed to their units. Throughout the night, work began. Thousands of laborers started digging trenches, approaching the walls in zigzag patterns that protected them from enfilade fire. Engineers surveyed the walls, identifying weak points and planning mining operations. Artillery pieces were positioned and camouflaged. By dawn, the Ottoman siege machine was fully operational. On July 17th, the first Ottoman cannons fired. The sound was like the world splitting apart. Massive stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds smashed into Vienna's walls, sending up clouds of dust and fragments of stone. Buildings near the walls shook with each impact. Some of the older structures, built centuries earlier, began to develop cracks immediately. The initial bombardment was psychological as much as physical. The Ottomans wanted the defenders to understand what they faced. Hour after hour, the cannons roared. The people of Vienna learned to recognize the sound. First came the distant boom of the gun firing, then several seconds of terrible anticipation, then the shrieking whistle of the ball flying through the air, then the thunderous crash of impact and the rumble of collapsing masonry. Starhemberg had prepared for this. He had ordered the construction of internal barriers and reinforcements behind the main walls. When sections were damaged by artillery, work gangs rushed to fill the gaps with earth, timber, sandbags, anything that would provide some protection. Church bells were melted down to cast new cannonballs. Furniture was torn apart to obtain wood for barricades. Even gravestones were pried up and used to repair damaged fortifications. But artillery was only one aspect of the Ottoman assault. The real danger came from beneath the ground. Ottoman mining operations were legendary for their skill and audacity. Sappers would dig tunnels extending hundreds of feet, burrowing beneath walls and bastions. These tunnels would be shored up with wooden timbers. When a mine reached its target location beneath a fortification, the engineers would pack the end of the tunnel with barrels of gunpowder, sometimes thousands of pounds of explosives. Then they would light long fuses, collapse the tunnel entrance, and retreat. The explosion would be catastrophic. The ground would heave upward, then collapse, bringing down entire sections of wall. Massive craters would appear, creating breaches through which assault troops could pour. It was terrifying and effective. The defenders could hear the enemy digging beneath them, the faint scratching and tapping sounds that indicated tunnels being excavated below. But locating the exact position of these mines was extraordinarily difficult. Starhemberg employed counter-mining tactics. His own engineers dug defensive tunnels, trying to intercept the Ottoman mines before they could reach their targets. This led to underground warfare of the most claustrophobic and brutal kind. Miners from both sides would occasionally break through into each other's tunnels. Fighting would erupt in absolute darkness, in spaces so confined that men could barely swing a weapon. They fought with knives, picks, shovels, bare hands, in air thick with dust and the stench of sweat and fear. No quarter was asked or given in these subterranean battles. The victors would collapse the enemy tunnel and continue their own digging. As July turned into August, life in besieged Vienna became a daily struggle for survival. The initial stocks of food began to dwindle despite careful rationing. Bread, the staple of the diet, was allocated in ever smaller portions. Meat became scarce, then rare, then non-existent. The garrison's horses, essential for any cavalry operations, were slaughtered one by one as food became critical. The meat was tough and unpleasant, but it kept people alive. Water was another constant problem. The city's wells provided some supply, but not enough for the entire population. Rationing was strict. Bathing became impossible. The smell of unwashed bodies filled the streets. Diseases began to spread. Dysentery, typhus, and other infections ravaged the population. The hospitals overflowed with the sick and wounded. Priests worked alongside doctors, offering spiritual comfort when medical help could do no more. The constant bombardment took a psychological toll that is hard to overstate. Day after day, week after week, the cannons fired. Sometimes in systematic barrages, sometimes in random patterns designed to keep the defenders constantly on edge. No one could sleep soundly. Any moment might bring the shriek of an incoming projectile and the crash of destruction. Buildings collapsed without warning, burying families in rubble. Fires started by hot cannonballs spread quickly through the densely packed structures of the old city. Yet the people adapted with remarkable resilience. Humans can endure almost anything if they have a reason to endure. The citizens of Vienna found strength in community, in shared purpose, in their faith, and in the leadership of Starhemberg. He made it a point to be visible every day, walking the walls even under fire, visiting the hospitals to speak with the wounded, checking on the work gangs repairing fortifications. The soldiers and citizens saw him limping from a wound to his shoulder, his face gaunt from short rations, his uniform stained with dust and blood. And they thought, if he can endure this, so can we. The church bells became a symbol of defiance. Despite the bombardment, despite the danger, the bells rang every day at their appointed hours. The sound of those bells told the Ottomans that Vienna still lived, still resisted, still refused to surrender. Priests held services in damaged churches, sometimes while cannonballs crashed into nearby buildings. People attended Mass, praying for deliverance, for strength, for the courage to face another day. There were moments of dark humor too. Soldiers made jokes about the Ottoman cannon fire, giving nicknames to particularly loud or accurate guns. "There goes Big Anna again," they would say when a certain gun fired. Gallows humor, but humor nonetheless. It was a way of asserting control over a situation in which they had almost no control. A way of saying, we are still human, still capable of laughter even in hell. In his green pavilion, Kara Mustafa grew increasingly frustrated. His plan had been sound. Surround the city, cut it off from all supply and reinforcement, pound it with artillery, undermine its walls, and wait for inevitable collapse. By all military logic, Vienna should have surrendered by now. The defenders were outnumbered, outgunned, running low on supplies, exhausted from constant vigilance in combat. But Vienna did not surrender. Every breach that was blown in the walls was filled in by desperate defenders working through the night. Every assault that was launched was thrown back with heavy casualties. The Janissaries, accustomed to victory, began to grumble about the stubborn Christian dogs who refused to accept their fate. Casualties mounted. Disease spread through the Ottoman camp, just as it spread through Vienna. The glamorous adventure of conquest was turning into a grinding war of attrition. Mustafa's subordinates began to offer suggestions, carefully phrased to avoid offending their commander's pride. Perhaps a massive assault with all available forces? Perhaps calling for reinforcements from other Ottoman armies? Perhaps even considering a negotiated settlement where Vienna would pay tribute but be spared destruction? Mustafa rejected all these suggestions. He had promised the Sultan a complete victory. He had boasted that Vienna would fall to his genius. To settle for anything less would be to admit failure. And Kara Mustafa Pasha did not fail. So the siege continued. More artillery was brought up. More mining operations were begun. More trenches were dug, snaking ever closer to the walls. The noose tightened, but still Vienna breathed. Far to the west in Passau, Emperor Leopold I worked frantically to assemble a relief force. His ambassadors rode to every court in Europe, carrying urgent pleas for assistance. The message was clear and stark. Vienna was the shield of Europe. If it fell, nothing would stop the Ottomans from conquering the entire continent. Today, it was Vienna. Tomorrow it would be Munich or Prague or Rome itself. Every Christian kingdom had a stake in Vienna's survival. Slowly, grudgingly, responses began to come. The Pope, Innocent XI, threw the weight of the papacy behind the effort. He declared that aiding Vienna was a sacred duty, equivalent to a crusade. He provided funds and diplomatic support. He pressured Catholic princes to honor their obligations. Various German states agreed to send contingents. Bavaria, Saxony, Swabia, Franconia. None could send large armies, but together they represented significant forces. Regiments began to march toward the meeting point that had been designated in Bavaria. But the real hope lay to the north. In Poland, King John III Sobieski was the only ruler in Europe with both the military capability and the willingness to confront the Ottomans directly. Sobieski was in his mid-50s, a seasoned warrior who had spent most of his adult life fighting. He had battled Cossacks, Tatars, Swedes, and Ottomans. He had won stunning victories against apparently superior forces through a combination of brilliant tactics, personal courage, and the effective use of his kingdom's greatest military asset, the Polish cavalry. The Polish winged hussars were legendary throughout Europe. These were elite heavy cavalry, aristocratic warriors who trained from childhood in mounted combat. They wore elaborate armor, carried lances that were often over 18 feet long, and had distinctive wooden wings mounted on their backs or saddles. These wings, made from eagle, crane, or goose feathers, created an eerie whistling, hissing sound when the hussars charged at full gallop. The psychological impact was tremendous. Enemies who heard that sound approaching knew they were about to face the finest cavalry in the world. Sobieski received Leopold's plea for help and summoned his council. The decision was not simple. Poland had its own problems. The eastern frontier was always under threat from Russia and the Crimean Tatars. Committing Poland's forces to a campaign in Austria meant leaving the homeland vulnerable. Moreover, the Polish nobility, ever jealous of royal power, would need to be convinced to approve the expedition. But Sobieski understood grand strategy in a way that few of his contemporaries did. He knew that if Vienna fell and the Habsburgs collapsed, Poland would be isolated and alone, surrounded by hostile powers. The Ottoman Empire would have a direct path into Poland from the south. There would be no buffer, no warning, no time to prepare. Vienna was not just Austria's capital. It was Poland's front line. He spoke to his nobles with passion and conviction. He painted a picture of what would happen if the Ottomans were allowed to succeed. The entire balance of power in Eastern Europe would shift. The Turks would dominate the region. Polish independence would be threatened. Christian civilization itself would be in mortal danger. This was not about helping the Habsburgs, whom many Poles disliked. This was about survival. The nobles were convinced. They approved the expedition. Sobieski immediately began mobilizing his forces. He sent word to Vienna, a simple message carried by riders who risked their lives to slip through Ottoman lines. "Hold on, we are coming." 3 words that brought tears to the eyes of the exhausted defenders. Help was on the way. Throughout August, various contingents of the relief army gathered in Bavaria and northern Austria. Duke Charles of Lorraine, the imperial field marshal, took nominal command of the combined forces. But everyone understood that once Sobieski arrived with the Polish army, real leadership would pass to the Polish king. Sobieski had the experience, the reputation, and the sheer force of personality that commanded respect. The Polish army marched south through the mountain passes of the Carpathians, a difficult and dangerous journey. 20,000 Polish soldiers, including 3,000 winged hussars and thousands of other cavalry, moved as quickly as conditions allowed. They were joined by contingents from various German states: Bavarians, Saxons, Swabians, troops from dozens of small principalities, all united by common cause. It was a remarkable moment in European history. Kingdoms that normally competed, that had fought wars against each other in recent memory, that distrusted each other's motives and religions, were cooperating. Catholic and Protestant soldiers marched side by side. German princes who had opposed Habsburg policies agreed to fight for the Habsburg emperor. Polish forces rode to save Austrian territory. The Ottoman threat had achieved what no pope or emperor had been able to accomplish: genuine unity among the Christian powers of Europe. The march was hard. Late summer heat made the roads dusty and the men thirsty. Supplies were always a problem. Feeding tens of thousands of soldiers on the move required sophisticated logistics that didn't always function smoothly. Cavalry horses needed enormous amounts of fodder. Artillery pieces and supply wagons broke down and needed repair. Men fell ill, struggled with injuries, and in some cases deserted when the reality of facing the Ottoman army became too daunting. But they kept moving. Every day brought them closer to Vienna. Sobieski pushed his forces as hard as he dared. He knew from messages that had been smuggled out of Vienna that the city was on the brink of collapse. Food was almost gone. Ammunition was running low. The garrison was reduced by casualties and sickness to barely 10,000 effective soldiers. Multiple breaches had been blown in the walls. Another major Ottoman assault might be the end. On September 6th, the relief army reached the northern hills overlooking Vienna. From the heights of the Kahlenberg Ridge, they could see the entire panorama of the siege spread out below them. The vast Ottoman camp surrounding the city, the smoke rising from burning buildings, the damaged walls and collapsed bastions, and in the distance, just barely visible, the towers and spires of Vienna still standing, still defiant after 2 months of hell. Sobieski met with Duke Charles of Lorraine and the other commanders. They studied the terrain, discussed strategy, and formulated a plan. The Ottoman army was focused on Vienna, with their back to the Kahlenberg. If the relief force could descend from the heights and strike the Ottoman positions from behind, they might achieve surprise and split the enemy's attention. It was risky. They would be attacking downhill, which gave advantage in terms of momentum, but made organized retreat difficult if things went wrong. And they would be outnumbered, even with their combined forces, by nearly 2-1. But there was no alternative. Vienna could not hold out much longer. If they delayed, if they tried to maneuver for a better position, the city would fall before they could intervene. It had to be now. It had to be a direct, decisive assault. Everything would be risked on a single day's battle. Inside Vienna, the defenders saw the lights on the Kahlenberg that night. Thousands of campfires glowing on the heights. At first, men couldn't believe what they were seeing. Was it real? Or were they hallucinating from exhaustion and hunger? But as more people crowded onto the walls and looked north, hope began to spread like wildfire through the city. The relief army had arrived. They had not been abandoned. They had not fought alone. All their suffering had not been in vain. Church bells began to ring spontaneously across the city. Not the measured tolling of regular hours, but wild, joyous pealing that echoed through the damaged streets. People who had barely had strength to stand found energy to embrace each other, to weep, to laugh, to praise God. Starhemberg stood on the walls, his wounded shoulder aching, his body trembling with exhaustion, and allowed himself the first smile in 2 months. He had kept his promise. He had held Vienna until help came. Now, they just had to survive one more day. In the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa also saw those lights. His heart sank as he realized what they meant. The Christian relief force had arrived in strength. His siege, which should have ended in quick victory, had dragged on too long. Now he would have to fight on 2 fronts, against Vienna's defenders and against a fresh army attacking from behind. He immediately summoned his commanders. There was no panic in his voice, no sign of fear, only cold calculation. The Christians wanted a battle. Very well, they would have one, and they would learn that Ottoman might was not so easily overcome. He ordered his troops to prepare defensive positions facing north toward the Kahlenberg while maintaining the siege operations against Vienna. Janissaries were redeployed. Artillery pieces were turned to face the new threat. Cavalry units were positioned to counter any charge from the heights. Trenches and earthworks were hastily constructed. Throughout the night of September 11th, both armies prepared for the confrontation that would come with dawn. Neither army slept much that night. In the Christian camp on the Kahlenberg, soldiers checked their weapons, sharpened blades, said prayers, and wrote letters home that many of them would never survive to send. Veterans who had fought in previous battles tried to calm the nerves of younger men who had never faced combat. Officers moved among their troops, offering words of encouragement, checking that equipment was ready, making final adjustments to the battle plan. King John Sobieski spent the evening in prayer. He attended Mass celebrated by the papal legate who had accompanied the army. Then he wrote a letter to his beloved wife, Queen Maria Casimira. He described what he was about to attempt, the odds they faced, and the stakes of the battle. "Tomorrow," he wrote, "we will either save Christendom or fall in the attempt. There is no middle path. Pray for us, my love, for we march to meet our destiny." In the Ottoman lines, similar scenes played out. Janissaries cleaned their muskets and inspected their powder supplies. Sipahi cavalrymen groomed their horses and checked their tack. Engineers made final preparations for explosive mines they intended to detonate during the battle. Imams moved through the ranks, reminding the faithful that death in battle for Islam guaranteed paradise. The green banners of the Prophet were blessed and raised high where all could see them. As the sun rose on September 12, 1683, the fate of Europe would be decided. The morning of September 12th broke clear and bright. The mist that had covered the valleys during the night began to lift as the sun climbed above the horizon. From the heights of the Kahlenberg, the Christian commanders surveyed the battlefield below. It was a vast natural amphitheater, with a ridge forming one side, the plain stretching toward Vienna forming the floor, and the damaged city itself forming the far boundary. The Christian forces deployed in a massive arc along the ridge. On the left flank, positioned to descend first, were the Austrian and Imperial troops under Duke Charles of Lorraine. These were professional soldiers, well-equipped and experienced, though not as numerous as anyone would have liked. In the center were various German contingents. Bavarians in their distinctive blue coats, Saxons known for their discipline, Swabians and Franconians bringing smaller but elite units. And on the right flank, positioned on the highest point of the ridge, were the Poles under King John Sobieski. The Polish forces were arrayed in their traditional formation. Infantry and lighter cavalry in the front ranks. Artillery positioned to provide support. And behind them, held in reserve for the critical moment, the winged hussars. 3,000 of Europe's most fearsome warriors, mounted on powerful horses bred for both speed and strength. The morning sunlight glinted off their armor and weapons, creating a display that was meant to inspire their own troops and intimidate their enemies. Before the advance began, Sobieski rode along the Polish lines. He was 54 years old, but he sat his horse with the ease of a man half his age. His armor was magnificent, gilded and decorated, marking him clearly as the commanding general. He spoke to his troops in a voice that carried across the ranks. He reminded them of their duty, their honor, and their faith. He told them that their families were watching from heaven, that their ancestors who had fought the pagans and invaders of old were watching, that God himself was watching. Today, he declared, "We do not fight for land or gold. We fight for our civilization, for our faith, for the very existence of our world." Today, we show the Turks that Christian courage cannot be conquered. The soldiers roared their approval, beating their lances against their shields, creating a thunderous noise that rolled down the hillside. Priests moved among the ranks, offering final blessings. Commanders embraced each other, knowing that some of these farewells were final. And then the horns sounded. The attack was beginning. The Austrian forces on the left flank descended first, moving through the forested slopes toward the Ottoman positions. It was difficult terrain for organized military movement. Trees and underbrush broke up formations. Gullies and streams forced units to detour. But the Austrians had local knowledge of this ground and used it to their advantage. They emerged from the forest in multiple places, striking at different points of the Ottoman defensive line, preventing the enemy from concentrating their forces. The fighting was immediate and brutal. Ottoman janissaries, positioned in hastily constructed earthworks, poured musket fire into the advancing Austrians. The range was close, the accuracy deadly. Men fell in rows, cut down by volleys that sounded like giant cloth being ripped apart. But the Austrians kept coming, closing the distance, returning fire, then charging with bayonets and swords in a hand-to-hand combat. This was warfare at its most primitive and violent. Men grappling with each other, stabbing, shooting at point-blank range, bludgeoning with musket butts and fists. The ground became slick with blood, the air filled with smoke so thick that soldiers could barely see 10 feet in front of them. Officers shouted orders that were drowned out by the roar of combat. Drummers beat out rhythms meant to keep formations organized, but in the chaos, organization was impossible. In the center, the German contingents pushed forward more slowly, maintaining better formation as they descended the less forested slopes. Their artillery, positioned on the higher ground, fired over the heads of their own infantry, dropping shot into the Ottoman ranks. It was effective but terrifying for everyone involved. Soldiers on both sides lived with the knowledge that artillery could kill friend as easily as foe if the gunners miscalculated. The Bavarian infantry, known throughout Europe for their professionalism, advanced in tight ranks, muskets leveled, maintaining fire discipline even under heavy enemy fire. They would halt, fire a volley, reload with practiced efficiency, advance a set distance, halt, and fire again. It was mechanical, relentless, and effective. The Ottomans facing them were forced to give ground, falling back from one defensive position to the next. But Kara Mustafa had positioned his forces well. Every time the Christians advanced, they encountered new defensive lines. Ottoman forces would fall back in good order to prepared positions, then turn and fight again. The Grand Vizier was a skilled commander, and he was not going to let his army collapse at the first assault. He rode among his troops, visible in his distinctive robes and turban, rallying men who wavered, directing reinforcements to threatened sectors, exuding confidence even as the situation grew more desperate. By mid-morning, the Christian forces had pushed the Ottomans back nearly a mile, but at terrible cost. Thousands of men lay dead or wounded across the slopes. Medical teams struggled to evacuate the casualties. Ammunition was being consumed at an alarming rate. And the Ottoman camp, with its reserves of fresh troops, still lay ahead, still dangerous, still capable of counterattack. Around noon, Kara Mustafa launched his counterattack. He had held his cavalry in reserve, waiting for the right moment. Now, as the Christian advance began to lose momentum, he unleashed his horsemen. Thousands of Sipahi cavalry, supplemented by Tatar light horsemen, thundered forward in a massive charge aimed at the center of the Christian line where the German troops were advancing. It was a magnificent and terrible sight, a living wave of horseflesh and steel rolling across the plain. The ground shook beneath the hooves of thousands of horses. Lances and sabers glinted in the sunlight. War cries in Turkish and Tatar dialects filled the air. The Sipahi were superb warriors, trained from childhood in mounted combat, and they struck the German infantry with devastating force. The German ranks buckled under the impact. Men were trampled, cut down, scattered. Formations that had been so orderly moments before dissolved into chaos. Officers struggled to rally their troops, to form defensive squares that could present a hedgehog of bayonets to the cavalry. In some places they succeeded, and Ottoman horsemen found themselves unable to penetrate the bristling wall of steel. In other places, the formations broke and cavalry poured through the gaps, attacking the Germans from behind, creating panic and flight. For a critical hour, the entire Christian attack seemed on the verge of collapse. The Austrians on the left were bogged down in heavy fighting in the forests and couldn't provide support. The Germans in the center were reeling from the cavalry assault, and the Poles on the right flank hadn't yet fully descended from the heights. It was the crisis point of the battle. If the Ottoman counterattack succeeded in driving the Christians back up the slopes, if it shattered the relief army before it could unite its full strength, Then Vienna would fall, Kara Mustafa would achieve his glory, and Europe would lie open to conquest. But the Germans held. Barely, desperately, but they held. Officers and sergeants rallied small groups of men, forming islands of resistance in the chaos. Artillery crews manhandled their guns forward and fired canister shot at near point-blank range into the mass cavalry, blowing horrific gaps in their ranks. And crucially, reinforcements arrived. Some of the Polish infantry units, moving faster than expected, came down from the ridge and struck the Ottoman cavalry from the flank, just as it seemed the Sipahi might break through completely. The Ottoman charge lost momentum, stalled, and then began to fall back. Horses and men were exhausted from the fierce fighting. The Sipahi withdrew in good order, but they withdrew. The German line reformed, battered but unbroken. The crisis had passed, but everyone on both sides knew that the battle was far from over. The decisive moment was still to come. Inside Vienna, Count Starhemberg had watched the battle unfold from the walls. He could see the vast movements of armies on the plain north of the city, hear the roar of musketry and artillery even at this distance, see the smoke rising from the battlefield. He knew that now, while the Ottomans were distracted by the relief army, was the moment to strike. He gave the order for a sortie. The gates of Vienna, sealed for 2 months, swung open. The garrison, though reduced by casualties and sickness to less than 10,000 effective soldiers, poured out of the city. They had been on the defensive for so long, absorbing punishment, enduring hardship, taking casualties without being able to retaliate effectively. Now, finally, they could attack. They struck at the Ottoman siege lines from behind, falling upon the trenches and earthworks that had been constructed to attack Vienna. The Ottomans defending these positions were taken by surprise. They had been focused on the battle to the north, never expecting the supposedly exhausted and starving defenders to launch an attack. Fierce fighting erupted across the siege works. Vienna's soldiers fought with the fury of men who had been pushed to the absolute limit of endurance. They overran Ottoman positions, spiked artillery pieces that had been pounding their city for weeks, set fire to supply dumps, and killed or drove off the enemy troops who had tormented them for so long. It was cathartic, vengeful, and strategically important. The Ottoman forces were now caught between two enemies: the relief army descending from the north and the Vienna garrison attacking from the south. Kara Mustafa realized the danger. His army, spread thin around Vienna and engaged in heavy fighting with the relief force, was at risk of being surrounded and annihilated. He needed to break one of the enemy forces quickly. He decided to commit his last major reserve, the full strength of his Janissary Corps, to one final assault against the Christians descending from the Kahlenberg. If he could smash the relief army, he could then turn back and deal with Vienna's garrison. The Janissaries advanced in perfect formation, their white turbans creating a distinctive visual marker on the battlefield. These were the elite troops of the Ottoman Empire, famous throughout the world for their discipline and courage. They had conquered fortresses, defeated armies, toppled kingdoms. They marched forward with absolute confidence, their muskets loaded, their officers leading from the front, their faith in Allah and in their own prowess unshakable. They struck the German center like a battering ram. The fighting that followed was among the most intense of the entire battle. For over an hour, neither side gave way. Men fired, reloaded, and fired again until their muskets were too hot to hold. When ammunition ran low, they fought with bayonets, swords, knives, fists, teeth. The ground became a charnel house, with the dead and wounded piled so thick that advancing troops had to climb over bodies. But the Janissaries, for all their courage and skill, could not break through. The German infantry, inspired by the knowledge that they were fighting for survival, held their ground. And all the while, more Christian troops were descending from the Kahlenberg, increasing the pressure on the Ottoman army, stretching Mustafa's forces thinner and thinner. By mid-afternoon, the entire Ottoman position was becoming untenable. They were being pushed back on multiple fronts. Casualties were mounting into the thousands. Ammunition and supplies were running low. Cohesion was beginning to fray. Small units were becoming separated from their commands. making coordinated defense increasingly difficult. And then, from the heights of the Kahlenberg, came the sound that would echo through history. King John Sobieski had been watching the battle unfold for hours, waiting for the perfect moment. He had held his cavalry back, keeping his most powerful force in reserve while the infantry and lighter troops did the hard work of descending the slopes and engaging the enemy. He knew that cavalry charging downhill achieved devastating momentum, but only if they had clear ground to build speed. He needed the battlefield to open up, needed the enemy to be weakened and dispersed, needed the exact right moment when one massive blow could shatter Ottoman resistance completely. That moment had arrived. The Ottoman army was stretched thin, engaged in heavy fighting across a wide front, their formations disrupted, their reserves committed. The ground between Sobieski's position and the Ottoman camp was relatively clear, with the fighting having pushed farther south toward Vienna. It was now or never. Sobieski turned to his cavalry commanders. He gave the order to prepare for the charge. 3,000 winged hussars began their final preparations. They checked their weapons one last time. They adjusted their armor and tightened straps. They murmured prayers and made the sign of the cross. Their horses, magnificent animals that had been carefully preserved and rested during the descent from the hills, sensed that battle was imminent and grew restless, stamping and snorting. Behind the hussars, thousands more cavalry formed up. Lighter Polish cavalry units, Panzerni and Cossack-style horsemen. Some German and Austrian cavalry units that had been integrated into the Polish formation. In total, approximately 20,000 horsemen prepared to charge. It would be the largest cavalry charge in European history, a desperate gamble to break the Ottoman army in a single, overwhelming blow. Sobieski rode to the front of the formation. At 54, he was older than most of his men, but he would not ask them to do anything he would not do himself. He drew his saber, a beautiful weapon that had served him in dozens of battles. He raised it high above his head where all could see. Behind him, the wings of the hussars rustled in the breeze, creating that distinctive hissing sound that had terrified enemies for generations. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. 20,000 horsemen, poised at the top of a slope, ready to plunge into the unknown. Below them, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers, bloodied but still dangerous, turning to face this new threat. In Vienna, defenders on the walls watching in breathless anticipation. Across Europe, in churches and palaces, people praying without knowing whether their prayers would be answered. Then Sobieski pointed his saber downhill and roared the order. Charge! The sound began as a rumble, like distant thunder. Then it grew and grew and grew into a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. 20,000 horses began to move, slowly at first, then faster, then at full gallop. The ground shook. The very air seemed to tremble. The wings of the hussars created a sound like 1,000 demons shrieking. The sunlight flashed from countless lance points and sabers. The earth seemed to come alive, to rise up in wrath and fury. The cavalry descended the slope in a massive wedge formation, with the hussars at the point like the blade of a knife. They gathered speed with every second, faster and faster, until they were racing at nearly 40 miles per hour, a wave of muscle and steel and absolute conviction. No force on earth could stand before that charge. Nothing could stop it. Nothing could turn aside. The Ottoman troops facing the charge realized what was coming. Some tried to form defensive lines. Some fired their muskets in desperate volleys that brought down some horsemen, but couldn't slow the mass. Some simply broke and ran, knowing that standing firm meant certain death. Officers shouted orders that couldn't be heard over the thunder of hooves. The Janissaries, brave to the last, tried to hold position, fixing bayonets, preparing to sell their lives dearly. And then the charge hit. The impact was cataclysmic. The Polish cavalry smashed through the Ottoman lines like a hammer through glass. The hussars in the front rank, with their 18-foot lances, struck like lightning bolts. A single hussar at full charge could impale multiple enemies with one thrust. The momentum was so great that entire formations were simply trampled, crushed beneath the hooves of thousands of horses. The sound was indescribable. The crash of impact, the screams of men and horses, the splintering of lances, the shriek of the wings. The cavalry poured through the breach they had created, spreading out, attacking in every direction. Lighter cavalry units peeled off to the flanks, riding down fleeing enemies. The hussars drove straight toward the center of the Ottoman camp, toward the great green pavilion of Kara Mustafa himself. Nothing stood in their way. Artillery pieces were overrun before the crews could fire. Infantry formations were scattered and destroyed. Supply wagons were trampled. Tents were torn down under the hooves of the charging horses. In less than 30 minutes, the largest cavalry charge in European history had shattered the Ottoman army. What had been a formidable military force became a fleeing mob. Soldiers ran in every direction, abandoning weapons, armor, supplies, anything that would slow them down. Officers tried to rally their men and were ignored or cut down. The retreat became a rout, and the rout became a massacre. Kara Mustafa, watching from his pavilion, saw his army dissolve before his eyes. Everything he had worked for, everything he had promised, everything he had staked his life and honor on, was collapsing. He had commanded 300,000 men. He had besieged Vienna for 2 months. He had been hours away from final victory, and now it was all turning to ashes. His bodyguards urged him to flee. The Polish cavalry was coming straight for him. If he was captured, he would be paraded through Christian capitals as a prize of war, humiliated before being executed. Better to escape now, to preserve his life, to perhaps fight another day. Reluctantly, Mustafa agreed. He mounted his horse and rode south, away from the battlefield, away from Vienna, away from the disaster he had created. The Green Pavilion, symbol of Ottoman power and prestige, was overrun by Polish cavalry. They found it filled with treasures, carpets, gold vessels, maps, documents, and the battle standards of the Ottoman army. Sobieski himself rode through the pavilion, taking in the splendor of what they had captured. He reportedly picked up a Quran, looked at it thoughtfully, and then set it aside carefully, refusing to desecrate it despite his victory. Even in triumph, he showed respect for the faith of his enemies. As the sun began to set on September 12th, the battlefield fell into an eerie quiet. The roar of combat faded. The smoke began to clear. What remained was a scene of almost incomprehensible carnage. Tens of thousands of bodies, Ottoman and Christian, lay scattered across the slopes and plains. Wounded men cried out for help, for water, for death to end their suffering. Horses, some wounded, some simply exhausted, stood with heads down, flanks heaving. Abandoned equipment littered the ground. Muskets, swords, armor, helmets, backpacks, all the detritus of shattered army. The Christian forces were too exhausted to pursue the fleeing Ottomans with full vigor. They had been fighting for 12 hours straight. Many soldiers simply collapsed where they stood, unable to take another step. But cavalry units, less exhausted than the infantry, did ride after the retreating enemy, harassing their retreat, preventing any attempt to reform, driving them farther and farther from Vienna. The Ottoman retreat continued through the night and into the next day. It was a nightmare march for the survivors. Harassed by pursuing cavalry, short on food and water, confused about where they were going or what they should do, the Ottoman soldiers streamed south and east. Some units maintained discipline and retreated in good order. Others dissolved into mobs. Tatar auxiliaries, seeing that the campaign was lost, simply peeled off and rode back toward their homelands, taking whatever loot they could carry. The losses were staggering. Of the 300,000 men who had marched on Vienna, estimates suggest that 50,000 or more were killed or wounded in the siege and battle. Many more would die in the chaotic retreat from disease, starvation, or attacks by local populations seeking revenge for Ottoman raids. Equipment worth millions was abandoned. Hundreds of cannons, thousands of muskets, massive supplies of ammunition, food, and treasure. The Ottoman army would not recover from this disaster for years. When the people of Vienna realized that the battle was won, that the Ottomans were fleeing, that they were actually truly safe, the reaction was overwhelming. People poured into the streets, many of them weeping openly. Strangers embraced each other. Families who had been separated during the chaos of the siege reunited. Churches filled beyond capacity as citizens gave thanks to God for their deliverance. The physical damage to the city was enormous. Large sections of the walls have been destroyed or severely damaged. Hundreds of buildings have been hit by artillery or burned. The streets were scarred with craters from exploding mines. Bodies needed to be buried. Defenders who had fallen during the siege, civilians who had died from disease or starvation or bombardment. The smell of death hung over the city, and it would take weeks of hard work to clear away the evidence of the nightmare they had endured. But Vienna had survived. Against all odds, against impossible numbers, against 2 months of relentless assault, the city had held. And Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg was the hero of that survival. When King John Sobieski rode through the gates of Vienna on the evening of September 12th, still covered in the dust and blood of battle, the first person he sought out was Starhemberg. The meeting between the two men was emotional. Starhemberg could barely stand, his wounded shoulder still bleeding, his body trembling with exhaustion. Sobieski dismounted and embraced him, and according to witnesses, both men had tears in their eyes. Sobieski spoke words that would be remembered. "It was your courage that held the line until we could arrive. Vienna was saved by its defenders long before my cavalry charged. You are the true hero of this victory." Starhemberg, ever modest, replied that he had simply done his duty. But everyone who had witnessed the siege knew better. He had been the soul of the defense, the embodiment of refusal to surrender, the man who had kept hope alive when hope seemed mad. The emperor would later grant him estates, titles, and honors, but no reward could truly repay what he had given. Kara Mustafa fled south with the remnants of his army, retreating through Hungary toward Belgrade. He knew what awaited him. In the Ottoman system, failure of this magnitude could have only one consequence. He had promised Sultan Mehmed for a great victory. He had boasted that he would take Vienna and open the road to all of Europe. He had been given unlimited resources, the full might of the empire, and complete authority. And he had failed catastrophically. Messages were sent to Istanbul informing the Sultan of the disaster. When Mehmed received the news, he reportedly flew into a rage, destroying furniture in his chambers, demanding to know how this could have happened. His advisors carefully suggested that perhaps Kara Mustafa had been too arrogant, too confident, too slow to adapt when the situation changed. The Sultan's anger found a focus. Mustafa must pay for this humiliation. On December 25, 1683, a messenger arrived at Kara Mustafa's camp in Belgrade. The messenger carried no letter, no formal charges, no explanation. He carried only a silk cord, the traditional instrument of execution for high Ottoman officials who had fallen from favor. The message was clear. The Sultan had ordered Mustafa's death. Kara Mustafa received the cord with dignity. He knew the customs. He knew there would be no trial, no appeal, no mercy. He had gambled everything on Vienna and lost. Now he would pay the price. He arranged his affairs, said his prayers, and submitted to his executioners. The man who had commanded 300,000 soldiers, who had dreamed of conquering Europe, who had come so close to achieving immortal glory, died alone in a tent, strangled with a silk cord. His death marked more than the end of a single life. It symbolized the end of Ottoman dreams of European conquest. The empire would continue to exist for more than 2 centuries, but it would never again threaten the heart of Europe. The tide had turned at Vienna. The victory at Vienna transformed the political landscape of Europe overnight. The Habsburgs, who had seemed on the verge of catastrophic defeat, were suddenly resurgent. Emperor Leopold I returned to Vienna in triumph, his prestige enormously enhanced. He had held together the Christian alliance. He had appointed the right commanders, and he had ultimately presided over a victory that saved his dynasty and his empire. But Leopold was wise enough to know that he owed his survival to others. He showered honors on King John Sobieski, offering him lavish gifts and formal thanks. He elevated Count Starhemberg to the highest ranks of imperial nobility. He rewarded the German princes who had sent troops with territories and privileges. He worked to maintain the unity that had been forged in the crisis of 1683. The Pope, Innocent XI, declared September 12th a feast day of the Catholic Church, the Feast of the Holy Name of Mary, to commemorate the victory. Across Catholic Europe, masses were held in thanksgiving. The siege and Battle of Vienna were portrayed as a miracle, divine intervention to save Christendom from the infidel. Art, music, literature, and sermons all celebrated the victory in religious terms. For Poland and King John Sobieski, the victory brought tremendous prestige but little lasting material benefit. Sobieski returned to Poland as a hero, acclaimed throughout Europe as the savior of Christendom. But Poland's internal political problems remained unsolved. The fractious nobility continued to limit royal power. The kingdom's borders remained threatened, and Sobieski would spend the remaining years of his reign fighting inconclusive wars on multiple fronts, never achieving the lasting security he had hoped for. The Ottoman Empire, meanwhile, entered a period of crisis and soul-searching. The defeat at Vienna exposed weaknesses that had been developing for decades. The military system, once the most advanced in the world, had become conservative and resistant to innovation. The political system was plagued by court intrigue and unstable successions. The economy struggled with inflation and competition from European trade networks. The disaster of 1683 accelerated these existing trends, beginning what historians call the long decline of Ottoman power. The Battle of Vienna had profound implications for military history. It demonstrated several important tactical and strategic lessons that would influence warfare for generations to come. It showed the continued power of cavalry when properly employed. In an era when infantry firepower was increasing, when many theorists believed cavalry was becoming obsolete, Sobieski's charge proved that mounted forces could still be decisive. The key was using cavalry not in frontal assaults against prepared positions, but in exploitation of opportunities, striking at the right moment against disrupted or exhausted enemies. It demonstrated the importance of combined arms, the coordination of infantry, cavalry, and artillery to create synergistic effects that were greater than the sum of their parts. The Christian victory was not achieved by any single arm, but by the effective integration of Austrian infantry, German artillery, and Polish cavalry, each playing its crucial role at the right time. It highlighted the challenges of siege warfare in the gunpowder age. Kara Mustafa had employed the most advanced siege techniques of his time, systematic approaches, mining, bombardment, yet had been unable to reduce a determined defense before a relief force arrived. The lesson was clear. Sieges were now wars of logistics and time as much as of engineering and firepower. An attacker needed not just to breach walls, but to do so before the defenders. And perhaps most importantly, it showed the power of defensive determination and morale. Vienna's garrison was outnumbered, outgunned, running low on supplies, and facing certain death if the city fell. Yet they held for 2 months, repelling assault after assault, repairing breaches as fast as they were made, maintaining discipline and cohesion despite appalling conditions. This demonstrated that will and leadership could compensate for material disadvantages to a remarkable degree. Military theorists across Europe studied the Vienna campaign intensively. Books were written analyzing every aspect of the siege and battle. Officers visited the battlefield and fortifications to learn lessons. The patterns established at Vienna, the importance of prepared defenses, the need for combined arms, the power of cavalry shock action, the criticality of logistics and timing would influence military thinking well into the next century. The Siege of Vienna became one of the defining events in European cultural memory. It was portrayed in paintings, described in poems, celebrated in music, and recounted in countless histories. The story had everything that makes for a compelling narrative. Desperate odds, heroic resistance, unlikely alliance, dramatic reversal, and ultimate triumph. It became a foundational myth for European identity, a moment when diverse peoples united against a common threat. In Catholic countries especially, the siege was given religious significance that went far beyond the military facts. It was portrayed as a new crusade, a holy war to defend Christendom. Sobieski was compared to legendary crusader kings. Starhemberg was praised as a Christian saint who had stood firm in faith despite all trials. The victory was attributed to divine intervention, to the prayers of millions, to the favor of Mary and the saints. Vienna reversed this dynamic. In the years following 1683, a reinvigorated Holy League, composed of the Habsburg Empire, Poland, Venice, and later Russia, launched a series of campaigns that pushed the Ottomans back across the Balkans. The empire that had seemed unstoppable was forced to cede territory for the first time in generations. In 1686, Buda, the capital of Ottoman Hungary, fell to Habsburg forces after 145 years of Turkish occupation. In 1687, the Ottomans were decisively defeated at the Battle of Mohacs, avenging the catastrophic Hungarian defeat at the same location in 1526. In 1688, Belgrade was captured. In 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz formalized the Ottoman losses. Hungary, Transylvania, and most of Croatia passed to Habsburg control. Venice gained territories in Greece and Dalmatia. Poland recovered Podolia. These territorial changes represented more than lines on a map. They signified a fundamental shift in the European-Ottoman relationship. For the first time in centuries, Christian Europe was advancing and the Ottoman Empire was retreating. The psychological impact was enormous. European powers that had lived in fear of Ottoman invasion now saw the empire as vulnerable, even weak. Ottoman prestige, which had been built on centuries of nearly unbroken victory, was shattered. The long-term consequences rippled through the following centuries. The Habsburg Empire, strengthened by its gains, became a major European power capable of challenging France for dominance. The Ottoman Empire entered a long period of internal reform and restructuring, trying desperately to modernize its military and political systems to compete with European powers. Some reforms were successful, others failed, but the empire never recovered its former dominance. In the Balkans, the retreat of Ottoman power created a vacuum that would lead to centuries of instability, ethnic conflicts, and great power competition. The Ottoman Empire's slow decline would eventually lead to the Eastern Question, the diplomatic crisis of the 19th century over what would replace Ottoman rule in southeastern Europe. The eventual collapse of the empire after World War I would create even more problems, many of which continue to affect the region today. For Vienna itself, the victory marked the beginning of a golden age. Freed from the immediate threat of Ottoman invasion, the city flourished. The Baroque architecture that still defines Vienna today was largely built in the decades after 1683. Magnificent palaces, churches, and public buildings arose from the ruins of the siege. The Schönbrunn Palace, the Karlskirche, the Belvedere, all were constructed in the atmosphere of confidence and prosperity that followed the victory. Vienna became not just a political capital, but a cultural center of Europe. Music, art, literature, and science flourished. The city that had nearly been destroyed became one of the jewels of European civilization. Composers like Mozart, Beethoven, and later the Strauss family would make Vienna synonymous with musical excellence. Philosophers, scientists, and artists flocked to the city, attracted by its wealth and patronage. The Vienna that tourists admire today, with its grand boulevards, palatial buildings, and rich cultural heritage, was built on the foundation of survival in 1683. The military lessons of Vienna were studied for generations. The concept of combined arms warfare, which had proven so effective in the battle, became a cornerstone of European military doctrine. Armies reorganized to better integrate infantry, cavalry, and artillery. The importance of logistics and supply lines, so clearly demonstrated during the siege, led to reforms in how armies were fed, equipped, and maintained in the field.